This is NEGOTIATEx TV.
Hello and welcome to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast. I am your co-founder, Nolan Martin, and with me, good friend, co-host, co-founder, Aram Donigian. Aram, how are you doing today, sir?
Great, Nolan. Good to see you.
Yep, absolutely. Let's get this one started.
Sure. Folks, it is a pleasure for me to introduce our guests today. Beth Bellman is an associate professor of instruction in the Tippie College of Business at the University of Iowa in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship. She earned her PhD in interdisciplinary studies, decision neuroscience from the University of Iowa. Beth has been teaching negotiation primarily to undergraduate students for the past 12 years, in person and online, in both synchronous and asynchronous formats. Professor Bellman believes that teaching students about negotiations can improve both their business and personal relationships as they learn to become better communicators and to take an interest-based approach to creating value. Nolan Moeller is a professor of instruction at the Tippie College of Business, University of Iowa, and has held senior administrative positions in higher education. He received his Juris Doctorate from the University of Iowa. Nolan worked in private law practice, served as faculty ombudsperson, and has conducted negotiation and conflict resolution training for corporate and nonprofit clients. Professor Moeller is a labor arbitrator and mediator and has been involved in extensive business negotiations and labor management collective bargaining sessions over the years. He has co-authored 3 other books in the areas of entrepreneurship, business management, and conflict resolution. Beth and Nolan are co-authors on the book, The Road to Success, Learning How to Become an Effective Negotiator, along with their colleague, Terry Bowles. Thank you both for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It's exciting to have the opportunity to discuss negotiations with you, specifically other educators interested in and committed to teaching this topic.
Well, thank you, Nolan and Beth. So I'm curious to get started. What were your motivations for getting into the field of negotiation and conflict resolution? Were there any key moments along the way? And Beth, perhaps you could get us started on this question.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I don't know that I got into it intentionally, and it has been a really good fit for me. So I was working on a master's degree many years ago, and I had some flexibility in my course selection, and the course sounded interesting to take as a master's student. I didn't know what to expect, but it turned out to be a very engaging course that really pushed me out of my comfort zone while being supportive enough that I could grow and learn about focusing on interests while simultaneously asking for more. So each week I would go to this class, and it was really my most exciting and simultaneously probably scariest class that I attended because I had to practice doing something that felt difficult. Then I had about a 10-year gap, and I was approached and asked to start teaching the class here. One of the things I love about teaching negotiations is that it's something that's very commonplace, right? We're all likely negotiating or have the opportunity to negotiate several or more times each day. And yet without some training or education, a lot of people might not leverage these opportunities to get more of what they want, out of their lives and in their jobs, for their organizations. And I think it also creates the opportunity for deeper connections with important people in their lives by deepening those communication skills. So I had some training on the topic at the graduate level and was then asked to teach it, and I've loved every moment and opportunity since then.
Thanks, Beth. Nolan?
Yeah, I'd say my influence, Aram, was I was in a graduate class during my master's program with a professor who was a labor mediator and arbitrator. And he'd come to class with these great stories about collective bargaining and negotiations and disputes between labor unions and companies. And he brought people into the classroom. I remember one time we had the chief negotiator from American Airlines and one of their large labor unions. And just the stories were fantastic. It brought to life our discussion about collective bargaining. And then I served as a research assistant for him and got a chance to kind of apprentice with him as with his labor arbitration practice. But you would see real stories about, people in the workplace. And I just found that really interesting. It brought what I was studying to life. And that led me to practice labor and employment law when I finished from law school. And then in law practice, I had a chance to be involved in both courtroom situations and then my own negotiations. And it just dawned on me that, I never got the sense that court trials are a good way to resolve any kind of conflict. They took too much time. They were very formalistic, whereas the negotiations I was doing with unions and employees and other attorneys seemed to be more productive, seemed more sustainable. And then that led me to look into mediation arbitration, and I started doing a little bit on the side, and then that brought me back to my alma mater to teach. And like Beth, I love teaching negotiation because it's a skill set our students need. I think they see the value in it. And it's one that is really cool. And you both know this, is you see the evolution of a student's progress from the beginning of a term to the end, how much better they are in terms of negotiation and the best point about communications.
Yeah, I love that point you both made, Beth, going back to just the practice involved, the push out of your comfort zone. And I'm going to assume, I know we're going to get into a little later, some of the design that you both do as you think about teaching this great topic. And I think that's such an important part, along with Lon, as you were mentioning, the stories. And I agree. I always get excited when I see students progress. I got to teach Nolan when I was teaching at West Point. He was one of my students, and he's one of those examples of just seeing somebody excel and progress over the course of the term.
Oh, thanks, Aram.
A little love there.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Lon, you have significant experience in negotiations outside of academia. You already mentioned some with American Airlines. Could you share an example of a particularly challenging negotiation that you've been part of, and what made it so difficult, and how were you able to help the parties involved to move forward or reach an agreement?
That's a great question, Nolan. And I was thinking about that the other day. I've had a lot of negotiations, both good and bad. But one that really comes to mind is one of the first ones I did as an attorney. And so I represented a company in collective bargaining with their large labor union. And the labor union represented their production employees. This was a factory setting. And my senior attorney said, you've got to reduce insurance costs. You've got to somehow negotiate a plan that employees pay for their own insurance. And the company wanted the same thing. Now, this company for probably 30 years had paid the entire 100% of an employee's health insurance premium. So that was kind of my marching orders to go in negotiations. And I was nervous about it. This is probably my second negotiation, but I worked hard. I was prepared. We had 4 or 5 bargaining sessions with the labor union. I made trades, as you have to do in negotiations. I walked away after 5 sessions getting what I thought was an agreement. And I thought everybody was on the same page that employees were going to pay 10% of their monthly health insurance premium. So I told my boss at the firm, I said, look what I got. I was really proud. I went back to the company. Look what I got. I was very proud. I wrote it up, sent to the union, and then discovered a problem. We had never really talked about when that 10% was going to kick in. So we had a 3-year contract we negotiated. I thought it was the first year. The labor union thought it was the 3rd year. And it dawned on me, I do what a lot of our students do that aren't comfortable with negotiations. I wanted to get through it as fast as I could. And the last thing you want to do is that last session when you think you have an agreement is to go back and make sure that you don't have any misunderstandings. And I failed to do that. And so I had to go back to the union, and we ultimately negotiated a deal where, they wanted year 3, I wanted year 1. Yes, we did. Year 2, right? But it was such a good experience for me because it explained to me why our students have a hard time with, getting through something quickly and not going back and writing things up and asking for clarification. Because, I would have asked the union, I would have said, well, of course, we're agreeing on year 1. And then they would have said no. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to go back and renegotiate this. So it was a really good teachable moment for me. It helped me kind of build trust with the other negotiators. But again, it's one of those situations that I learned a lot from. And I passed those lessons on in my class.
Thanks for sharing. Then you've also been a faculty ombudsperson. For listeners not familiar with that role, could you share what you do?
An ombudsperson office or a position is usually part of an organizational conflict management system. And an ombudsperson is neutral. They may be employed by the organization, but the conversation they have with throughout the university's faculty, staff, and students is confidential. But my job as a faculty ombudsperson, Nolan, was to listen to complaints that faculty, students, or staff may have, give them ideas about solutions, talk to them about resources, and then periodically I might get involved as part of the problem-solving process if they wanted me to. So I didn't act as an attorney. I didn't act as an advocate. I really didn't even act as a mediator. but as more of somebody who understands conflict, who can kind of help people walk through their system, their situations. And I think one of my great takeaways from that, Nolan, was that, not everybody wants you to solve their problem. And a lot of people in a conflict situation, nobody's listened to them. And so there's a lot of compelling reasons to sit down and listen to hear somebody's stories. And I was always kind of surprised because, by nature, I'm a problem solver, right? That's what we do in negotiation. We try to fix things. And I'd hear these stories and I'd get all excited. And then they say, no, I'm good. I just wanted somebody to hear me out and listen. And, I teach conflict management too. And I tell students that, there's two parts of it. One, you've got to, build a rapport with somebody. But hearing somebody's story at a point of impasse or conflict is critical because at that point, they think no one listens to you. And so in my knowledge or my experience as an ombudsperson, I discovered, sometimes that's really part of the solution in terms of conflict resolution. Have somebody hear your story.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that.
And I'm wondering, so Beth, I wonder how much of this relates to your rich background in decision neuroscience. I'm curious, how does that background impact how you think about negotiating and how you approach teaching the subject to your students?
Well, I think it keeps me thinking about and remembering that our choices and decisions are not based solely on our rational, optimized choices, but that our feelings and emotions play a strong role in behavior. And so acknowledging that role in negotiation and practicing or teaching students to discover what their choices and goals are based on, being able to articulate those underlying interests and uncover what's important to the person they're negotiating with are central to any negotiation or to many negotiations. Basically continuing to consider and teach that our emotions and our emotional needs impact what we do. So I can't just teach about the mechanics of negotiation, but I encourage students to take a holistic approach when negotiating, to pay attention to their feelings and to work toward integrating what they want in their heads and intellectually with what they want in their hearts and trying to express both of those.
Why is becoming a more effective communicator so relevant, both to negotiation as well as success in both our personal and professional lives?
Yeah, great question. My own opinion on that is that communication is really a foundational skill to relationships. Like Lon was saying, so often people just want to be heard. And I will explain to my students that being an active listener, which is a theme throughout the book, and I'm sure we'll return to this in a bit, it doesn't signal agreement, but that people want to be heard. And a lot of times, especially when they're really emotional, either upset or excited, it's that hearing and that it doesn't signal agreement. So I think being a better communicator, and I would include intra-communication. Are you aware of what you want and need? Are you then willing and able to attempt to articulate that, share that with others, personally, professionally, even if you don't come to agreement? So I think it's a central core negotiation skill in relationships, in business, within organizations, to build teams and effectiveness.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about how that shows up in your book.
All right, we've mentioned the book twice, so let's go ahead and dig into it then. What inspired both of you to write The Road to Success, Learning How to Become an Effective Negotiator? How does it differ from other texts on the topic, and why the analogy of driving? Lon, perhaps you can kick it off.
I'm happy to do that, Nolan. So Terry Bowles and Beth and I had taught a lot of undergraduate students, and a lot of the cases we were using and the text we were using really aimed at an MBA level student. And I remember one time using a case study that involved the sale of a big apartment building that had zoning issues and a lot of things that most of the undergraduates had no idea what we were talking about. And so it dawned on Beth and Terry and I that we really need a book that is more directed at undergraduates and some of the issues they have. For example, negotiating an apartment lease, working out agreements with the roommates on a cleaning schedule in an apartment, buying a car, or getting that first job, doing that first salary negotiation. So we try to write a book that's really aimed at undergraduates, kind of get at their level in terms of the type of negotiation situations they were seeing, and then using a lot of the traditional negotiation rules and principles and applying those to a situation maybe they were more comfortable going to in terms of negotiations. Now, why the driving analogy? I think at the time that we started kicking this idea of a book around. I was trying to teach one of my kids to drive. And my oldest daughter, and she'll deny this, but she read the driving manual. She's watched people drive, and she thought, this is easy. I could do this. She was prepared. And then you put her in the front seat of the car and you put her on a street to drive. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is a lot harder than it looks. And I think I told Terry that story, and we started thinking, well, that's like a lot of our negotiation students. They read the book, they go, well, this is easy. I've seen people negotiate until they start doing it in class. Then they realize it's difficult. And we thought in terms of driving, you've got to, like a negotiator, you've got to learn how to drive. There's a lot of different skills you develop, and it's a lot of awareness skills. Communicating with passengers in your car, communicating with people on the road. Driving is situational, much like negotiations. I'm going to drive differently if the weather changes or road conditions change. Planning is analogous to what we do in negotiations as well. If I'm going to take a short trip across town, I'm planning differently than if I'm taking a cross-country drive. Then lastly, sometimes we need people to help us. I've got a flat tire, I need somebody to fix it. Much like in negotiations, if I have an impasse, I might have to use some strategies, or I may have to have a third party help me.
I like to say, Lon, my oldest is just learning to drive. We're hopefully within a couple months of her getting licensed. And I tell folks, I didn't have any gray. There was no gray before we started there. So, Beth, anything you'd add in terms of the motivation for writing this book?
I agree with what Lon said. Some other things I love about the book is I think it's really easily accessible. It's short in length. It's got some images, a little bit of color to break things up. And I have found that undergraduate students are very likely to read the entire chapter when assigned. So it's accessible, short sections. I think it covers the basics, the foundations, the mechanics, and some of the major issues that are important to consider in negotiation. A lot of the other textbooks I've looked at, they have great content. They're more traditional style of textbook, and I just find that less inviting for our undergraduate audience to read and really engage with. But they're not put off or daunted by how accessible this book is, and so it gets them involved with the material pretty seamlessly, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and if you can get your undergrad students to be reading every chapter, I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, I count that as a win for sure.
Right. All right. We know a book like this is like a child, right? Or like children. You love all of it, right? You love all the chapters. Do you have a particular chapter or maybe a section or kind of concept from the book that was just your favorite to really delve into and write about, and why was that? And Beth, I'll give this to you for the first response.
Yes, I appreciate the context of it is difficult to pick, but if I have to pick just one, I'm going to go with our content on reference points in negotiations in Chapter 3, Distributive Bargaining. And the reason for this choice is if I had to pick the top 5 things that I want students to know or remember at the end of a semester-length course, reference points in negotiations would make my top 5 of things I hope they can remember downstream. So of course this has to do with planning, identifying, what your alternatives are, the BATNA in case you're unable to come to an agreement, what those alternatives are, aspiration level. One of my mantras is aim high, as long as you can justify what you're asking for, and that integration of authoritative standards and knowing what your bottom line is. So that's the choice I'll go with today and the reasoning for it.
Great.
What about you, Lon?
Well, I agree with Beth. I have a hard time choosing my favorite chapter, but if I have to, because you've asked me to do that, I would probably pick Chapter 12, which gets into the use of agents for negotiation, some impasse type strategies based on the work of Robert Urey, and then using third parties like mediation, arbitration, probably because that's a lot of things I do. Now, many of our students are going to act as an agent when they get out upon graduation, negotiating on behalf of their employer, for example. And they certainly may use an agent as they progress in their lives, buy or sell a house, things of that sort. So that kind of foundational knowledge is important. I think it's important to have some idea of what you do at a point of impasse, because oftentimes, we even see that in class exercises where students get stuck. and have some kind of strategy or game plan you can use if you do reach an impasse is helpful. And then understanding the difference between mediation and arbitration. A lot of commercial contracts, for example, have mediation arbitration as a step. And so our students who may or may not end up going to law school need to have some knowledge if that is a language in our contract, what does that mean? And then how do I prepare for it?
You discussed what to do at an impasse. I'm just curious. Could you dive into a little bit about kind of what you talk about there?
Yeah, that chapter focuses on Robert Urey's book, Getting Past No. And there's a 5 or 6 step process that Urey has identified. But the first one is what he calls going to the balcony, where you kind of take a step back and say, okay, what's going on here? What's happened? Why are we at a point of impasse? And then putting yourself in the other person's shoes and reframing the discussion so that it's more interest-based, to use a phrase that Beth came up with. And think about, he talks about a golden bridge. How do you identify interests you have in common? How can you find a middle point that allow you both to come back and reach some sort of agreement? Now, the last step, I always think this is helpful, and this kind of relies on the idea of BATNA, which Fisher Urey wrote about in Getting to Yes, is what's going to happen if we can't reach an agreement here? What's that going to look like to us? And that's really what using power to educate means. But it gives students in particular an idea, okay, I don't just give up. I don't just start pointing fingers. I got to kind of start looking at myself first. And I like Beth's point. A lot of our students, and I think this is true in most negotiations, they really don't know what they want. And in fact, I had a conversation with a student the other day who was negotiating a job offer. And he was putting his salary ask probably 10 or 15% higher than what I thought he should. But he wanted recognition for what he'd done in college. And so this is more than just that tangible, I want $20,000 more. I want recognition for what I've accomplished. I want recognition that, I could hit the ground running for your company. And so, we started talking about his wants being more than just salary, but he's using salary as kind of a proxy to reflect an interest that was important to him.
I always find it so interesting when I'm talking to, clients of ours, and we bring up the BATNA, but more importantly, the agreement that you may or may not come up with has to be better than your alternative. It's not just, what your BATNA is, it's that the agreement you reach needs to be better than that alternative. Sometimes they're so happy and exercises just to come up and say, we got an agreement, and we're like, outstanding. Is it better than your alternative? Well, I didn't really think about it. So so I appreciate you sharing that.
I want to go back, Beth, to what you were saying. You surprised me, given what was in your bio about interest-based negotiations, that you went to the distributed bargaining chapter. I'm curious. So you want to say a little bit more about kind of that, and maybe even share with us what the rest of your top 5 are.
Absolutely. Well, I think that we happen to have reference points in the chapter on distributive bargaining, and they are not unique or restricted to only distributive bargaining. That was just a logical place to include them in the book. Of course, we encourage students to identify the reference points in integrative bargaining as well. So just to clarify that. And I would also comment on what Nolan was saying, this distinction between BATNA and bottom line. Early in the course, I really emphasized the difference between those, precisely to avoid that scenario that Nolan's describing of, okay, I can come away with something that's equal to or is my BATNA, and we're, of course, encouraging them to create more value for both parties. Let's see, I think you asked, probably my next favorite topic is the chapter 9 on perception, heuristics, and biases, because I love social cognition and I'm trained as a social psychologist in part. So that's one of the areas I really enjoy.
Would love to ask you more about how does that come to life whenever you're training your students or teaching any of your clients or anything like that, with regards to the psychological aspect to negotiations. Are there any, key focus areas or anything like that you try and tell students?
Really, we cover a handful of these biases and heuristics. And for me, it's really about awareness. Are we aware that we're automatically, most of the time subconsciously, doing these, relying on our assumptions or categorization via stereotypes, whatever the issue is. And so once students are aware of these things and that they tend to happen, they've been shown empirically to happen for most of us in many situations. If they can just interrupt or hit the pause long enough to ask themselves, am I making an assumption here? Right? Am I being, loss averse, or am I stereotyping based on some assumption? So really just starting with awareness of these things and trying to get people to notice and then hit the pause and check those assumptions out. Move forward, gather more information during the negotiation, and then decide how to move forward. So and mostly awareness. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it goes back to, I think what you said at the outset, Beth, which is we are negotiating quite frequently. Sometimes we don't realize we are, so we don't show up as skillfully as we should. That pause, that awareness to test our assumptions, challenge our natural mental model can be incredibly helpful.
Hey everyone, Nolan here. I have to jump in and end today's podcast for part A of the show. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast if you haven't already. And also join us next week for part B of this awesome interview. Hey, thanks for checking out this video on NEGOTIATEx TV. If you found any value at all, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification icon if you want to be notified of future videos. And then we also have a couple videos over here that you might be interested in checking out. If you and your small business, your team are looking to get negotiations or leadership training, then you can head over to NEGOTIATEx.com and learn more about the coaching services we offer. Thanks, and I'll see you over in the next video.